Education is something that we all have gone through, hopefully, whether it's street education or formal education. And this episode of Mental Filter, we're going to talk about everything related to education with someone who's been in the education world for quite a long time. And she's been able to see the evolution. We've all gone to different types of schools, public, private, more formal, less formal, religious, not religious. And it's going to be an interesting episode to get her perspective on how education has changed. There's no question, no matter how old you are, it's probably different than what you experienced unless you're in school right now. Some for the better, some not so much. And there's so many topics we could have broken down here when it comes to discipline or what the expectations for the students, the mental health of students, and the educators. We try to cover as much as we can in this episode. I appreciate you joining, listening, reviewing. Take a second to rate it, to share it, etc. That is all helpful for us to get out there. This is Mental Filter. All right, welcome back to Mental Filter, everybody, with our co-host of the day, Stacey. As you heard in the introduction, we're going to talk all about education today and how it's changed, certainly since Stacey and I have been in school, and maybe for a bunch of you. So, Stacey, I'd like just tell everyone who you are, what you do, and we'll go from there.
My name is Stacey Herring. I am a high school math teacher. I have been teaching for 26 years. I started in middle school, moved to high school 22 years ago. I teach AP Calculus, Honor Statistics this year, and college level statistics also.
Wow. All the things I'm terrible at. There's a reason why I'm a therapist and I'm not in something that requires much math.
It's not for everyone.
It's not for everyone. I asked most of the people that are on what led you down this path, what drew you to education in general, and then prep for the things that the subjects that you teach in particular.
My high school geometry teacher is probably the reason why I'm a high school math teacher. I went to college with the idea I wanted to teach math or Spanish and ended up dropping the foreign language and stuck with math. Started in middle school because I was 21 years old and thought that probably being in a high school I looked like I was still 12, so it wasn't the best thing. And then after 4 years in the middle school, I was either going to quit or move up. And my principal suggested that upper level math was probably where I wanted to be. So I went to the high school and I'm still here.
Wow. Is this through the public school system?
Yes.
Okay. What was your first experience like?
Oof. My first year of teaching was horrible. I almost quit in the middle of February. I had like horrible, horrible seventh graders who made me cry every day, but I got through it. And the next year, my department chair was nice enough to give me some higher, better behaved classes, so to speak. And we just kept working our way up. And now the high school was definitely a different ball game. And now I teach the upper level kids and some seniors, and I don't have those problems anymore.
So how many different grades have you actually taught?
7 through 12. The only grade I haven't taught secondary is sixth grade. I have not taught sixth grade.
Got it. Maybe an unfair question. If you have to pick which grade students are the worst and why?
Well, middle school in general as a whole is terrible. They're all about touching each other. They smell horrible after PE. In the high school level, ninth graders, the difference between ninth and 10th grade is huge, like how much they grow up. Ninth graders still have that middle school mentality, and that difference between ninth and 10th grade is huge. Seniors end up with senioritis, but I don't like teaching juniors either because then I have to write college recommendations.
So it's like pick your
10th
challenges.
and 12th would be ideal.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So in the beginning it was rough going. So one second, we're talking, what year is this? This has got to be
1999 was my first year of teaching.
1999.
True story.
Yeah, I graduated high school in 1999. So
Okay.
that's a hot minute ago. So you may have to give this a little thought or two. So we're talking 1999. So out of whoever's watching, whoever's listening, obviously we're in 2024, 25 years, right? What are some of the standout differences as just education in general or particular school environments, students, teachers? We can go through all of them, but what's sort of some of the difference thinking back to like, wow, super different.
Minus, well, obviously the technology. I mean, I started with chalk and overhead projectors. I'm a lefty, so I came home with marker all up and down my arm every day. So we don't use overhead projectors anymore. Obviously, it's mostly all whiteboards, and now there's one screens, and all of that kind of technology is huge. So the technology is obviously drastically different. State testing has changed drastically. Every other couple of years, there's a new type of state testing they want these kids to do. What else has changed drastically? The introduction of cell phones in students' hands has changed the classroom environment. And curriculums have changed so much that they were, and this is more very recent, teacher-based, teacher-written curriculums, and now it's like vendor-based. We're buying curriculums and trying to implement them.
So can you explain that just a little bit to the layperson what that means?
Yes. So back in the day, and for many, many summers, teachers got together over the summer and we would write curriculum. So, hey, let's pilot this geometry book and then write a curriculum around it. I was a part of that. I did it for statistics. The teachers wrote the curriculum. We know the kids, and then we would implement that curriculum. Now, with all of the standards being basically universal, so Common Core standards across the United States, vendors have come out, they write curriculum, and it's all aligned to those Common Core standards. So instead of having teachers do that, public school systems have gone to, oh, hey, let's just buy this curriculum from this vendor and have our teachers implement it.
And what are your feelings on that?
I think it could work, but the problem is the vendors are making curriculums based off of whatever new fad is happening in education, right? So let's say we're talking about, oh, student-centered learning is the way to go. And so they build this whole curriculum based off of that. And then 3 years later, now there's another new fad and it's exploratory learning. So the vendors are making the curriculum based off of that. They haven't been in the classroom. So they're not seeing necessarily that the changes in students don't actually go along with the fads that are happening.
You're the boots on the ground.
Correct.
You're on the front lines and you get to see it, but that's not really being taken into account.
Well, and I think a lot of times, and a lot of teachers say, people who make decisions about education aren't actually in education. And so they think one way, but they're not in it to know whether it's going to work.
Hey, okay, so that's important. I think many people listening and watching can relate in many different ways. Who are the people making the decisions and are like in the medical profession? Are they the ones who are seeing patients and, making those decisions? Is there any part of you or maybe colleagues of yours that appreciated, even though it was your summertime, but was there any part of you being part of the creative process and developing curriculum? Was there any part of you that liked that?
Enjoyed doing it. It also gave you ownership to it. So when you were teaching that course, you were more invested in it, maybe. I think the problem with the vendor curriculums is that it's so scripted that it takes the individual teacher out of the lesson plan, right? So the lesson plan's so scripted, it it leaves it so that there's nothing for the teacher to like come up with on their own.
There's no creativity, there's no individuality, and it's almost like dumbing it down so much that if you're an educator, you're an education. Put it this way, you're not an education for the salary.
That is correct.
So you want to educate and you want to bring your own personality and your own input into the education, but you can't really, which is a little bit like disempowering.
And the issue is, depending upon where you are, you can't veer off from the vendor created curriculum. You have to teach to it. Other places you might have some leeway like that. That's the nice thing I think about private schools. They get to do whatever they want.
Right. Right. That's true. Were you ever tempted to teach in a private school?
No, but I'm not saying it's not possible after retirement.
Got it.
I mean, I've got 5 years left. I can retire in 2029. It's
Right.
possible. Small class sizes would be fantastic.
Right. You mentioned a couple of great things earlier, and without sounding like we're sitting here preaching about the ills of society and technology, but you've seen, I guess, the evolution or the journey of students who, like you said, there was no technology, there was no phones. How have you seen it affect both the students themselves, the way they socialize, and also affecting the way you teach?
Well, that's a double-edged sword. I think initially when phones started to be an issue, it was like, hey, we can get kids engaged by using their phones. So there were a lot of new apps that came out or like software that came out that kids could take their phone out to use it, like Kahoot and Plickers and some other things came out that so kids were using their phone for educational purposes. Then app creators decided to start making apps to help the kids cheat, like photo math. That presents a whole different problem of cheating. And then there's the whole social media aspect where they spend all day dealing with that, that they're now no longer even cheating and paying attention to class. They're focused on their phone because of the social media and everything that that's done to them.
So, painting with a very broad stroke, is it fair then to say that the student in 2024 is far less engaged than they were in 1999?
Yes. I just, I think they're engaged. I think they're just engaged differently.
Go ahead.
I was a straight honor student, AP student, whatever. So I was in all classes where kids were always engaged. It wasn't until I started teaching classes that I was like, oh wait, there's behavior problems in classes. Engagement is definitely an issue. I think we all thought when we were in school that it was important. And now I think kids are not that interested in education because they can find the answer to anything they want at the push of a button.
The question is, does the average student genuinely want to learn and other things get in the way, or are they just not really interested in learning?
Even my top level students, I don't think are as inquisitive as they used to be. Do those students still want to learn? Yes, but the questions they ask are not based on their actual curiosity in the topic anymore. When I first started teaching, the questions that they would ask were like, they really wanted to understand and see where they could take it. Now they ask questions because they're interested in their grade. Their incentive is their grades. Their grades are for their college and their diploma and all of that. That's the only incentive they have. They only care about grades. I think that the high school student these days doesn't see it as learning. They see it as a means to an end. And that means to an end is a grade to get into a good college.
Wow. Wow. I'm not disagreeing. It's a means to an end because then if you can get a degree, then you get a certain job and you can make certain money so you can do certain things.
Exactly.
But the truth is we all have to sometimes relate to that, meaning like even the people that I work with, and sometimes we have to accept that certain things are a means to an end. We know that they're important, and we know, and we need to sort of convince ourselves, okay, this has to get done because if it doesn't, then this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this can happen, even though I don't really, really, really want to do that. But that's a really unfortunate, yeah.
I mean, even my upper level kids, it's like, well, what's the answer? They don't care about the why, the steps in between, like the perseverance to go from point A to point B when they get stuck on a problem isn't there. They just want to know the answer and they want the answer to be right because they want the good grade.
You mentioned perseverance. Have you seen a downturn in that, the drive, the motivation, the resilience to push through problems, challenges, or it's just like, yeah, just either it's handed to me, I get it. If I don't, then whatever, I just throw my hands up.
Oh, yeah. And that's a part of the whole cell phone, internet phenomenon, too. The instant gratification of a trig identity that takes 13 steps They want to go from the beginning to the end in one step because of this instant gratification that they're used to. And so, no, they don't want to put the work into it. They don't want to persevere. And they definitely don't care about how to get there. They just want to know that their answer is correct. If they cheat their way there, or if they photo math it, or they chat GPT it.
Wow. I have to believe that there's some people still out there that care. Please tell me.
There definitely are. I mean, they're not all this way. It's a generalization, but I think technology is great, right? But at the same time, paper and pencil worked so well for so long that now they have all of these tools, and they're using these tools to get through things faster. I always joke around, like, you guys don't understand. Like, the internet went out. I know how to use a phone book. I know how to read a road map. I know how to go to the library and take the Dewey Decimal System and find a reference book, right? They'd be lost because they're just so used to that instant gratification of an answer at their fingertips.
Who's to blame then? If someone's listening up until the point of like, hey, we're just sitting and trashing kids these days, and we could be sitting in a rocking chair on a porch just with a shotgun ready to shoot whoever walks by. And we're not, if I was a teen now and I had all that at my fingertips and I was able to get things so easily, would I be as motivated? I don't know, maybe not. Seeing it through their eyes, I don't necessarily blame them. At the same time, it can have an impact because once they make it through high school and they make it through college and then they enter the workforce, if that belief continues that I want to go from here to here, I don't want to start at a job that pays pretty low and have to work in. I have a brother who is in the food industry. He's an event planner, caterer, and he says with pride how he started washing dishes. Like
Right.
that's where he started, and he has done every single job along the way up until where he is now. And that's a source of pride. And again, not to indict a generation, it's just if that continues, then what's going to happen when you can't get a job that is instant X amount of money?
That's a fantastic question. I know that when I started teaching, the starting salary when I started versus what it is now is drastically different, which kind of upsets me. I mean, it's good for the people who are starting. It's horrible for me in 1999.
Right.
I don't know. I think this is why there's a lot of 25-year-olds still sitting on the couch at home because they want to work from home and make a whole lot of money, but that job doesn't exist.
Right. Well, if you were the decision maker, what kind of things would you do to help the students, to help education?
I think it starts at home. We always say that, right? You definitely see the difference with the parents who always read to their kids and then the ones who limit phone time or the limit TV time. Even as a kid growing up, you were only allowed to watch TV for a certain amount of time. Other than that, you should have been reading or doing something else. I think limiting screen time and what they do with it, monitoring that is huge. I think educators are to blame. Like, maybe we need to take that out of the equation and go back to paper and pencil. But we're literally handed these tools and told because they have them, use them until there's a consequence for it. I feel like there is no way to change it, right?
That's okay. So that's a really good point. First of all, I was already picturing, imagine someone opened up a school now, like the paper and pencil school. It might be like so retro that people would go for it. That'd be pretty interesting. So, okay, so what you're speaking to now is like, well, we talked about motivation of the students and maybe a little bit motivation of the educator. Let's go up another level. What is the driving motivation for administrators, school districts, boards of education? What's driving their motivation? And that's going to be the answer to any sort of challenges without getting yourself into trouble.
I'm going to say that their motivation is test scores and what's publicly released. So each school gets a rating, right? And then now you're rated in your school system. So you don't want to be at the bottom of that, right? The state is rated based on their state test scores, and that, I believe, affects funding and then their rate in the country. I think it all comes down to money, funding, and then test scores. The amount that they test these kids, and then while they're testing these kids, they're pulling them out of their classes, but yet still expect them to get through a curriculum and know a certain amount of stuff. Like, our math classes had 8 days of testing last spring. Like, that's 8 days of instruction lost for state testing. And then they want to know if they do poorly on it. Well, you took me out of class for 8 days to test. Maybe that's the day I missed the lesson that was on that test.
So it's all about, you want to set them up for success.
I mean, that's the idea, right? But there's all these other obstacles that get in our way. And every year there's more and more obstacles that get in the way.
Right. A lot of it boils down to money and funding. And if someone handed a school a limitless amount of money, then they wouldn't have the pressures to do certain things, and they wouldn't feel forced to make certain decisions, which ultimately cost the education.
There's also state funding for public schools. I have 4 classes of over 32 students. If there was more money, I would have a class size of 20 where I could give those kids that individual attention. I could see every kid while I'm standing at the front of the room rather than trying to. I have a class this year that I have to walk out one door into the other to get to the back of the room because I can't fit through the aisles because of how many kids and all of their stuff is there.
No way.
Yeah. So like all of those things, and that's why the private schools have it so nicely because their class sizes are so small, right? I have a class of 34, 31, 32, and 30. I can't possibly reach every kid in 90 minutes and get through the whole lesson and make sure every single one of them is on task, is engaged, understands. I can't even, some of them I can't even reach in their row because they're up against a window with 5 other kids in front of them.
How many kids were in the class 10, 15, 20 years ago?
It varies. I mean, back in 2000, they've done like they cut a bunch of teachers last year, right? So they cut all sorts of teachers, and they've done this once before where they cut a bunch of teachers, and they did it this past summer to make the elementary schools class sizes smaller. But when you cut teachers from the secondary level, our classes are bigger. So it's across the board in the core classes, the class sizes are bigger. It varies. I've had years where not this big and 4. I've had classes of 30 before, but 25 is pretty good. 20 would be ideal.
Right. So how does this, I'm not intimately familiar, but I've heard from more than one person about not just being fired, but over the last, I want to say like 5 years, there's been a little bit of an exodus of teachers. Is that accurate?
Yes. So your teachers who are close to retirement, if they can retire without giving the full 30 years or whatever, have retired because every year they just keep adding on to our workload. You have new teachers coming in who, unfortunately, and again, like you said before, you don't want to blame a whole generation, but the work ethic is completely different than some of the teachers who have been there longer. And they are also of the generation where they are also about this instant gratification. It's like, well, where's the worksheet? Well, maybe you have to make it. Maybe you have to think about what you want them to do. So the younger teachers are getting out faster because they realize they don't want to do this. The older teachers are retiring earlier or not staying past the 30 years. And then you've got people stuck in the middle, which is where I've been for the last couple of years because I got to give them my 30 years. It's pointless for me to not because I lose my benefits, all of that. So I'll stick it out because I have to. I mean, my 30 years, it's only till 2029. I'm not that far off.
So the exodus is happening. Is there a real shortage of teachers at this point?
I don't want to throw numbers out there that I'm not 100% on. I know that like my school has a vacancy. A lot of schools currently have vacancies. So you've got long-term subs or no teachers in certain classes. It was really difficult for us to hire teachers this summer. And it's weird because they cut all of these teachers, but then they had to hire other ones back because people always quit, resign, and retire. So why did you cut them in it's a very interesting cycle because they have to cut them before the end of the year. So they finish out the year, but they have to go somewhere else, right? and then your school ends up with a vacancy because somebody decides to retire middle of July. So if that teacher had retired earlier or made that decision earlier, the teacher who was cut could have stayed. It's a very interesting domino effect.
And there's a trickle down effect because then it's going to be even more compromised education. And then what do you expect from these students if it's even more compromised? It's this cycle that continues. Let's shift back to the students a second here. The evolution of a student's mental health, right? So I'm in the mental health field. I see plenty of students. How have you seen their well-being change over the last 20 years?
When I started teaching, mental health was not even something that we talked about in the classroom. There was no SEL lessons. There was definitely that huge influx wave, whatever you want to call it, when ADHD was like, oh, hey, everybody now has ADHD. And I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying that that's not a thing. I'm just saying there was a huge wave when all of a sudden everybody was diagnosed that way. Then between what happened with COVID and how that changed kids' mental health, and then coming back, and again, social media has killed it. So their mental health, I mean, it's a real deal. I have kids regularly who are out for days at a time. They end up in crisis, and it's hard because they don't ever get away from it. We went to school with people, your peers, right? So let's just talk about that. We're in school with our peers. You have a fight with your best friend. You go home, you don't have to deal with it for another 12, 14 hours. Now they go home and they're looking at it online and everybody's talking about it, and it's somehow in a Snapchat, somehow on Instagram. So they're dealing with it constantly. They never get to get away from it. And then they come back and it starts all over again. Bullying is the same thing. It's not just happening in the building. That kid goes home and he has to deal with it online.
They don't get a break. It's
They
like
don't get a break.
I think of Calvin and Hobbes and his lunch money getting taken, but then he goes home and then
Right.
he doesn't have to deal with his lunch money getting taken. Although that's not cool either. That's a really good point. The cycle doesn't end for them. Wow. I have a tricky question, which is difficult to answer, and I get this question a lot of times too. I want to hear from an educator's perspective. So the word accommodation, right? Lots of students have accommodations. Now, in my
Okay.
world, working with a lot of anxiety, accommodation in it of itself is not a terrible thing. Accommodation in my world, when it comes to anxiety, is I'm doing something as a way to we'll call it maintain the homeostasis, the equilibrium of a child. And when I say child, I mean all the way up through adulthood to minimize the anxiety or the disturbance. Now, up until a certain point, not all accommodation is bad, right? If we're sitting at the dinner table and say, hey, could you get me a spoon from the drawer? And I'm there, okay, I'm going to bring you the spoon. But if I don't want to touch other spoons because maybe there's one that's dirty, so can you go ahead and do it for me because I don't want to touch anything, otherwise I'm going to have to wash my hands. That becomes unhelpful. So there's like this tricky balance of accommodating that's helpful until it becomes unhelpful. Now, in the education world, they also use the word accommodation, and sometimes those two worlds sort of collide a little bit and overlap because there's educational accommodation because someone has a learning challenge, a learning disability, learning disorder, and to learn and to take tests in the same manner, a uniform way as everyone else is just sets them up for failure. But it also can include the students, so you said ADHD, or they have anxiety, or they have trauma, or they have whatever. Sometimes it could be really tricky. I literally have recently been talking to some schools and educators. Where do we draw the line? How do we know? Well, they said that they need this accommodation, or even the therapist said this is hard for them. Like you alluded to earlier, is like, well, just because something's hard, I'm not trying to sound callous, just because something's hard doesn't mean that we shouldn't push ourselves to get through it, because that will help build up this strength and resilience. But we also don't want to set them up for failure where, okay, suck it up, buttercup. You have to be able to manage everything. That doesn't help anybody either. So that is a very, very long-winded question, but there's no like fantastic answer. But I'm curious here from an educator standpoint, what have you observed as far as like accommodation, helpful, unhelpful? What are your thoughts on that?
I'm going to take this in two different directions. The first one is something that I used to joke about when I first started teaching, and that was the accommodation of preferential seating. So you have a kid who gets easily distracted or a kid who can't see, you have to have preferential seating. And I'm like, if I have a class of 25 and 18 need preferential seating, you need to give me a classroom of just one front row, right? That's like sometimes it's virtually impossible to accommodate everyone's accommodations. The big accommodation that I see is mostly extended time, and that's extended time for all sorts of reasons like test anxiety or their learning disability. That's another accommodation that I think for a lot of kids is real. Those are easy to deal with. I had a student with dysgraphia, so everything I needed to blow up and make sure pictures were on a page by itself. And that's something that you can deal with. When you're dealing with the child who I'm not supposed to confront him because that's pushing his buttons, that to me is like, when does this child eventually get disciplined then? If everybody's just letting him do what he's supposed to do, and I'm not a parent. So that's another part that like I don't have the background in because I don't have to discipline a child of my own. But when we have children walking around the building, it's like, oh, you know, if you confront him, he's just going to be nasty and he's going to curse at you. Well, why am I supposed to accept that? And that happens. Like, oh, just let that kid go. Those are the things that I have a hard time calling them accommodations. So those kids get put on behavior plans. There's supposed to be checks and balances happening, but yet I'm standing in the hallway and I get told to F off because he's just allowed to do that. Is that an accommodation because that I'm allowing him to do that? I think there are kids who figure out, oh, wait, my mom's manipulated or somebody's manipulated it for me that I don't actually ever get in trouble when I do bad things. So I'm just going to continue to do them. But then there's a whole world of accommodations with reading and chunking and the real ones that actually have to happen.
It's like the old saying, like the bad apples ruin it for the rest of them. As you were talking, I sort of came in my head, what is a accurate way of describing what an accommodation is? I think a helpful accommodation is one that leads the student to succeed and to thrive and to grow more. If the accommodation is just setting a lower standard and doesn't help them thrive and grow and learn more, then is that really a helpful accommodation? So someone who needs extended time, like you said, and that's going to help them learn more and not feel stupid, fabulous. If they learn visually and they need something in images, and that's so if that's a springboard to learning more, that's helpful. If it's
Right.
just like, okay, let's just lower our standard, where does it end? Several months ago, I won't name the person, someone who had left education. This is in a lower school, not in our state. And part of the reason why they left was because you mentioned discipline. There was like zero autonomy and zero backup from the school on being able to discipline. And frankly, this teacher was being like manhandled by little kids, and it was very unsettling for them. And there was no backup. I'm sorry, you can't do anything. Like, how much is a person supposed to take?
Right. I was pushed in the hallway last year. Okay. So there was a whole conversation with the student about it. And the response that that student gave was, she got too close to me and touched me with her breast. And I'm like, excuse me? You pushed me. Okay. Number one. Number two, do you know how close you have to stand to someone for that to actually happen? And number three, if you had turned around when I told you to turn around and go down the stairs, you wouldn't have been anywhere near me.
Wow.
But there was no consequence to this child because he had a response that was like, we can't do anything about it because this is what they're saying.
Do you have any memories of where there was a shift in discipline happening in schools. Now, I'm not saying that we should have corporal punishment like they had, back in the day, but do you remember a shift?
Yes and no. I think a lot of it is that the kids that we're looking at now, and I hate to say this because I don't want to offend anybody, but were babies were having babies. And those babies, when those kids started to get older, they wanted to be their friend and not their parent. So now when the kid runs the household, they also come to school and think that they can do it. Some of these children, their parents come in and they're like, well, I can't do anything with him either. And they literally think that the school is responsible for disciplining their child, but then they won't back us up when we try to do that either because they have no control over them.
You know what? Some people might be offended by that, but I think there's accuracy to it. Is that in any system, so let's say in a family system, there's the parent and then there's the child. The job of a parent is not to be their buddy, in my humble
Well,
opinion.
I had an SRO once say to me that things were going downhill because somebody told children they had rights. And I don't think you should be beating your children and all of that. But all of a sudden, it was this, oh, my mom hit me kind of mentality that everything stopped. You couldn't spank your kid anymore. And I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't. Again, I don't have children, but that resonated with me because now all of a sudden kids were like, oh, this person said this to me. That's not right. Let me get them fired kind of mentality.
To look at this medically, our brains are not fully developed until we're about 26 years old.
Well, that's the male brain, right? Not the female brain.
Female brain is fully developed by the time they're 12, correct. There's a reason why they live at home and they have parents. There's a parent and then there's a child. It makes sense that it spills over. There's some sort of breakdown in, you want to call it authority. So an educator is another form of, we're not going to call you a parent, but you are that figure. What makes you different? What makes you better than me? We can't necessarily point to one particular time where that has shifted. There's a bunch of things that have shifted probably over the years, whether it's the expectations of the child, of the student, I should say, the discipline, mental health, general society. Are there different homework expectations?
I think that depends on the level of the class that a student is in. There's definitely classes that don't get assigned homework because they know it's not going to get done. You have a certain type of student in some classes that are going home, they're watching their siblings, they're cooking dinner, they're going to work themselves because they themselves are an earner for your family and they're never going to get homework done, right? Whereas you have other students that don't work jobs and they go home and they sit down and they bust out their homework. There is a line where that happens and it's unfortunate, but you see it every day.
I'm glad you brought that up because, again, if someone listens to only part of this episode, we sound horrible. We're not horrible. We sound like we're sitting here like, just do it. I've seen it. You've seen it. There's very, very real challenges out there that really are major obstacles for a student, even if they do care and they are motivated to just have basic education and to be able to do homework and to learn. And who knows what's going on at home for them and what kind of resources they have at home or time, like you said, like leaving school and then going to work or going to watch their siblings, or what kind of food do they have at home? What kind of like safety do they have at home? These are like just the prerequisites to be able to do anything. So I hope you all are still listening so that, I mean, I haven't been canceled yet. I hope
I wouldn't want to be a student in this day and age. Like,
that
I
is
would
fair.
not want to be an adolescent or a teenager in this day and age in any way, shape, or form.
You mentioned it earlier, but we didn't spend time in it. Can you speak a little bit from your perspective, the impact COVID had on the educator, school environment, and the students?
Hopefully, we're coming out of it now. I've definitely seen it start to shift back to pre COVID. There's just new problems now. I think the hardest thing during COVID, the hardest thing was they're on a computer, they didn't turn their screens on. It was just very minimal work. So every kid has like a year and a half gap where they didn't learn everything they should. Even the top level kid didn't necessarily learn everything they would have that year. So from March of 2020 through the beginning of that following year, there's gaps in their education. Nobody can deny that. They weren't in the building. The second part of it is they legitimately forgot or just stopped learning how to speak. Like they came back to schools and forgot how to speak. Like literally don't say things. I remember having them in my room and I'm like, they would walk up to you and just start talking. I'm like, first of all, there's an excuse me, there's a good morning. They just forgot altogether because for so long they were just sitting at home doing whatever, that the socialization aspect for some, if they weren't actively trying to do stuff, forgot basic etiquette, socialization skills, all of it. It's coming back. I think there are plenty of kids who loved the fact that they could hide out in COVID. Like they were the kid who wants to sit in the back row and never participate. Some of them thrive in COVID because they're like, this is my jam, I can do this without being called on and being embarrassed or having to go to the board and nobody has to see me. Some kids thrive. Others, the cheating, the socialization, the gap in education, all of that is effects. And that's how I'm going to make it as short and concise as possible.
Those are all really good points. I've seen it. I treat a lot of anxiety. So I've said this before. I'll say it again. I remember working with this guy who had social anxiety, and when COVID first started, it was exactly like you said. Oh, baby, I don't have to see people. Amazing. But it was fascinating that after not that long, he was craving social interaction, even though he had social anxiety. It's just like those little interactions, he missed that. So it's very interesting what you said about they were out of practice of social interaction. Did you find also that some of them had less confidence to be able to speak up and socialize or talk in class?
After coming back,
Yeah.
yes and no. I think the hardest part was the ones who didn't have the confidence to turn on their camera and talk while we were learning virtually. They were perfectly fine to just chill in the back and write in the chat box. But then there were the ones who religiously turned their camera on and wanted to be involved because they were making the best of that situation. But those kids who turn their camera on are also kids who participate regularly in class. There
Right.
are other kids who also participate regularly in class who just took the opportunity to be like, I'm going to take the easy way out.
You mentioned bullying before. I have found, and I've been in schools before, I've been placed in schools before. I find it to be one of the most difficult issues to tackle because it's systemic, and really need a village, and you need really everyone on the same page. We've already said before how bullying has changed because of the social media component. What have you experienced trying to tackle bullying in general, and what have you found to be even moderately helpful when it comes to that?
This is not something that I'm actually all that well versed in
Okay.
because I don't actually see it. I've definitely caught kids saying stuff, and it's like, come on, man, you don't say that to people. That's the extent that I've seen. I've heard about instances in my building where it's way worse. I just haven't been a part of it. I haven't witnessed it. The stuff that I typically deal with, because, and maybe it's because of the student that I teach, is the cyber stuff. Who's saying stuff online because who went out with who, or who was at a party, or who did this and who did that, and how all of that trickles down. The idea of photos that you shouldn't take, that's the stuff that I see at the high school level. I definitely don't see things like we saw on Saved by the Bell where Screech got put in a locker, right? Like you don't see them picking up a kid and tipping him over and sticking him in the trash can in the cafeteria. That kind of stuff doesn't happen. There are still fights in school, but those are over adult things that we surely weren't dealing with when we were in high school. They're fighting over boyfriends and girlfriends, and they're fighting over, unfortunately, drugs and things like that are more prevalent. Vaping and all of that. They try to sell these vape pens, and then they get in fights because somebody took a vape pen, and blah, 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 blah. But as far as name calling and stuff like that, I don't actually ever see that in my room. So I haven't had to tackle it head on. I think I've had one conversation about two girls that were in my room getting catty with each other. I'm like, we're not doing this,
Which is, by the way, which is part of the challenge, because hearing it from a student, because it doesn't take place in front of the teacher. It takes place in the hallway or before school, after school. the yard, the cafeteria, and it's so hard unless you have someone standing there the whole time. It becomes really hard. Do you keep up with former students at all? Do you get to hear from them?
It's so funny you asked that. Last night I was teaching my Towson class, and one of my seniors who graduated last year sent me a message, and she's like, "How's your first week going?" I'm also the student government advisor, so I built some pretty strong relationships with some leaders of our building. So I do, even though Facebook is now for the older generation,
Mm.
these kids do graduate and they do get on Facebook and they do friend request you. So there are some that I keep up with. There are some that I will always keep up with. It's even funnier to run into them 5 or 10 years later, and they're always amazed when I remember their names. I always feel terrible if I cannot place them. I'm like, "Man, 26 years, 150 kids a year. What year did you graduate?" Former students via social media is how I keep up with most. I do have a few that I am in contact with.
So your first students are
Old, 38, they're almost 40. So I used to bartend also. And I can remember the first time one of my middle schoolers came into the bar to celebrate her bachelorette party. And I was like, "Oh, hell no." Like, I'm like, "You were 12. What do you mean you're getting married? I don't understand."
I'm not allowed to serve you. I can't.
I was in line for the state fair a couple of years ago, and one of my former students was in line with a stroller, her husband, and a kid on her hip. And I'm like, what? What's worse is that I now teach with other teachers who are students that I taught. So there are teachers in my building that I taught when they were in high school and now they are teaching. And some of them have been teaching with me for many years. That was a tough pill to swallow. And it'll be a tougher pill when I get one of my students' kids. I think is going to affect me. And I think somebody told me it could be coming soon.
Well, I know a guy you could talk to if you need. I'm kidding. Wow. We're gonna wrap it up in a minute. I guess if you're being honest, if someone was thinking about going into education now and they call you up, "Hey, Stacey, what do you think? What's your elevator pitch on education?"
Wow, you want me to be honest? I tell everyone to get out as soon as possible. I don't see it getting any better. I wish it would. I don't see it getting any better. And the idea that you're in it for 30 years, 26 years ago, I didn't think I was going to make it 5. And then I hit 10 and then I hit 15. When I hit 15, I'm like, well, I'm in it now, right? Like now I'm on the downhill part of it. I don't see it getting any better. And unfortunately, it's just it's so thankless sometimes that and it's getting worse. You used to get cards that said thank you and things like that, and it's more and more thankless. But at the end of the day, we need teachers, and if it's something that is inherent in you, it was always something I wanted to do. Without sounding arrogant, I'm good at it and I enjoy it. The actual teaching aspect is fantastic. To be in the classroom teaching students, watching them learn, watching that, oh, wait, I get it now, is fantastic. It's all the other stuff that makes it almost unbearable and not worth it. So if you can deal with all that other stuff, go for it if it's inherent in you. But if it's like, I'm going to try this for a little while, not something I'd be like, go team.
I appreciate the candor. I have a tremendous amount of respect for teachers. We all remember that one teacher, that two teachers, that was a good teacher. And I really got something out of that class. They cared, they were passionate. I have such tremendous respect. But like you said, it's not all roses, that's for sure.
Not every day is sunshine and rainbows. That's
And
life. So
that is life. And it also speaks to the little things, a little thank you, a little card, like that goes a long way. People need to feel appreciated.
I mean, don't get me wrong. When I have an awesome lesson and the kids get it and they're like jamming, I'm like, this is why I do this. And then there's days that I'm like, all right, is it June yet? Like, Tuesday, literally Tuesday, I said, I need a day off. I just started on Monday. Like, how could I need a day off? So fortunately, I
Oh.
have Monday off for Labor Day.
All right, Stacey, thank you so much. This was
You're
awesome.
welcome.